Na ir toliau norėčiau pakviesti José Palacios Garoz iš Ispanijos universiteto Castellón Jaume universitete, muzikologą, kuris paskaitys pranešimą Vizualumas, žodiškumas ir girdimumas Lorquian visatoje, poetas Niujorke. Prašome.
Good evening, everybody. Dear colleagues, dear scholars, dear students even, I'm very happy to be here with you, sharing this time in such a beautiful day, in such a nice place. After so interesting and marvelous frame, with music, Lithuanian music, fantastic. After so many colleagues that before have been speaking about Čiurlionis, and probably some of you are asking, why speak to Lorca in a Congress of Čiurlionis? Well, I will explain you. I'll try to explain you. With the last beast of the turbulent 19th century, in very distant places, nature was prodigal in generating two genius, two exceptional multifaceted artists. Čiurlionis in Lithuania, Garcia Lorca in Spain. And as a flower of a day, both died young, in their 30s. Most likely, neither of them knew of the existence of the other, but they did share the same time in the convulsive European society of this time. Like in a fugue, in 1875, Micholaus Constantinas Čiurlionis was born first. Curiously, that same year, Carmen, Bizet's opera set in Andalusia, a land idealized by the 19th century Romantics, premiered. He began as a composer of late Romanticism in his symphonies and piano miniatures, then painter with musical titles such as Prelude, Fugue, or the sonata that inspires this Congress. Federico García Lorca was born in 1898 in Fuentevaqueros, Granada, Andalusia, Spain. This month of June 2023 just marks the 125th anniversary of his birth. He also began as a musician, and from there he became a painter and poet. Here you have Andalusia, is this part of Spain, the south, and he was born near Granada. Granada is the more emblematic part of Andalusia, especially in the flamenco, cante hondo, that Lorca loved very much. Okay, both were multifaceted artists, like true Renaissance men. Čiurlionis, composer of music and painting, according to Messiaen. Lorca, as well, painter of drawings and poems, as he defines himself. Both in love with the folklore of their country, the modern musical language, as the Hungarian Zoltán Kodály stated. Highly sensitive people, they have to live in very different environments. Ciurlionis in Lithuania and Europe, Lorca in Spain with his trips to America, North America, it's better? Yeah. North America, Cuba and South America. I hope that talking about Lorca here in Druskininkai, by comparison, in addition to the rapprochement between our countries, contributes to a better understanding of the work and personality of both Ciurlionis and Lorca himself. Federico García Lorca. In this same place, 9 years ago, in 2014, I had the honor of speaking about my countryman Federico García Lorca as a painter and as a musician, but it was an intentionally incomplete study. What remained to be studied was just his best-known facet, but also the less translatable, that of poet, in addition to his international dimension. As I announced it, the future poet wanted to be a musician rather than a writer. He began to study piano with his teacher Antonio Segura, and after his death, he resumed his hobby when he met the composer Manuel de Falla. He is Manuel de Falla, the author of Amor Brujo, El Sombrero de Tres Picos, a lot of compositions, very Spanish with the Spanish roots. And that is how in June 1922, Lorca and Falla organized the first Cante Hondo Flamenco contest festival in Granada, a cultural manifestation that involves music, guitar, percussion, voice, and on occasions even dance. Was so important that year of 1922 that is considered the year zero of flamenco, the beginning of this kind of music, of manifestation. In those years, he began his university studies in law at the University of Granada, being a student of Professor Fernando de los Ríos, future Minister of Justice, Minister of Public Instruction, and Ambassador from Spain in the USA, friend of Lorca's family, and father-in-law even of Federico's brother, Francisco García Lorca. To the right, you have the sepulchrum of Francisco and Laura de los Ríos, daughter of Fernando de los Ríos. In 1928, Lorca published his Romancero Gitano, Gypsies' Ballads, where he showed his preference for folklore, especially Andalusian and Gypsy folklore. And the reaction was mixed. While his popular success led him to be known in Spain, lecturing conferences and poetry recitals, among his fellow artists of so-called generation of 27, there were those who did not welcome him with the same benevolence. Among others, Dalí and Buñuel, calling him the poet of gypsies, Chien Andalou, dog Andalut, and that hurt Lorca. Lorca's poetic work is extensive and difficult to understand even for us Spanish speakers, even more so for those who, like you, receive it translated. In both cases, the drawings and the music, I trust, help us to understand it better. Among such an extensive body of work, impossible to analyze in such a short time as this communication, I thought it opportune to rescue a brief collection of drawings and poems, a book especially distant from his Andalusia. It is truly an exceptional book, for several reasons, because of Lorca's own vital and personal situation, because of his international dimension, because of the complex socioeconomic situation of the West, and especially of the city of New York as the world economic epicenter at that precise moment. All this conglomerate of synergies gave rise to a fruitful poet in New York. On the other hand, as is well known, Lorca's open homosexuality and his defense of minorities such as gypsies caused him serious problems in that homophobic Spanish society almost a century ago. And it happened that at that time he separated from his friend Emilio Aladren. It is impossible to understand poet in New York without the imprint of this love affair and the criticism by Dalí and Buñuel. The trip. It was in spring of 1929 when Professor Fernando de los Ríos proposed to his student Federico to accompany him on his trip to New York, to Columbia University. He accepted, seeing the opportunity to learn English, change his life, and renew his work. They boarded the Olympic, sister ship of the Titanic, at the beginning of June 1929, and arrived in the Big Apple on June 26. Life itself is a journey, and trip is already itself an exceptional experience, even more at that time, and to a big city like New York. Lorca always recalled his stay in New York as one of the most useful experiences of his life. It was his first trip abroad. In March 1930, he left New York to go to La Habana, Cuba, where he explored Cuban culture and music, before coming back to Spain 3 months later. New York. What was New York like in June 1929 when Lorca arrived in the city? What impression did it make on him? Undoubtedly, for the traveler, New York City had and still has impressive artist elements, especially the architecture of the skyscrapers that point to the sky and the hectic rhythm. Unquestionable elements that, however, contrast with the deep and slow-paced interior landscape of Lorca and accentuate the feeling of loneliness in him. All of this was enhanced by the socio-economical circumstances that led to the Great Depression of 1929 and the terrible scenes of suicides on Wall Street. He described the city as a place of war and death, geometry and anguish, surprised by the capitalist economy and, above all, by the treatment of blacks, as he defined. Lorca, a man of an exquisite social conscience, thus justified his sensibility. Being born in Granada has given me a sympathetic understanding of all those who are persecuted, the gypsies, the black, the Jew, the Moor, which all Grenadians have inside them. What happens in his mind and heart? How does he process it? Through what channel of his palette does express what he feels? The book. This is the Columbia University, where she was studying and giving some conference. This is the sundial of Columbia University with friends at the same place. And this is the first edition of Poet in New York. As I have advanced, Lorca expressed his impressions in Poet in New York, a book that he never saw published since it came to light in New York and in Mexico for years after his death. Poet in New York, Lorca said, is part son of myself, part the wasteland. This is the first edition in Mexico, not in Spain at this time because we had the dictatorship. But the edition of New York was 2 or 3 months before than the Mexico edition. This edition has a poem of Machado, and Antonio Machado and José Bergamin, and other poets. Okay, aware of the importance of the book, he wrote to his family on January 1930. I prepare conferences, I study English, and above all, I write. I think that the point that I am making of New York with graphics, words, and drawings is a very intensive thing. So intense that will not be understood, and it will cause arguments and scandal, he said. Indeed, it has been considered perhaps his most important and representative work, although, as he intuited, difficult to understand. There he expressed in powerful language the painful slavery of man and machine together. It's a curious mixture of poetry and drawings, as he had already commented to his friend Garoz in July 1927. Now I began to write and draw poetry. Given the time available, we will analyze a drawing and 2 poems. Among the drawings, one stands out as a figure and summary of the New York experiences. It is the one known as Self-Portrait in New York. In it, Federico represents himself in a schematic way, with an oval face and bushy eyebrows. No sé si se ve, no, but you can see it here. Eyebrows. The New York skyscrapers appear in the drawing, but their windows are numbers and letters here. It is the brutal capitalism that only understands figures. The self-portrait outlines it quite well. Branches of nerves or blood, the sexual and the divine, the cruelty of capitalism. Federico stands among scrapers harassed by 4 animals, black animals. The threatening animals stand out: horse, lion, or dog, inevitably associated with the chien andalou, the dog andalou of Lorca and Buñuel. This animal changes from white to black when it crosses Federico's environment, Federico's profile. To the left is a small garden, vertical garden. Black dots that suggest pollen, a sign of fertility, fly into the air from the set of filaments. Flying over the whole, a small female figure here floats with her little branch of nerves, the only tender motif in the middle of urban chaos. In short, it is the image of the poet, sunk among the buildings while trying to protect himself from the wounds of desire and solitude, from the languishing geometry, from the vital locked up in the human capitalist city. It is finally Federico's fight with his own ghost and those of the threatening city. Poems. Translating Lorca, probably the greatest Spanish poet of the 20th century, and translating Poet in New York, probably his greatest book of poems and drawings, has required reverence, caution, and wildness. It is a collection of surrealistic poems in response to the vitality, violence, poverty, and social turbulence of New York City at this time. Among the poems he composed in New York, the first part is meaningfully titled Poems of Solitude at Columbia University. And within that section, the first is L'Aurora, dawn. In his brevity, it's an accurate synthesis of his vision, a symbolic and terrible world far removed from the placid, the morning, for example, or romantic composer like Grieg. I'm going to read the left column in Spanish so you can hear its original sound. You can read the translation to the right at the same time to understand. La aurora de Nueva York tiene 4 columnas de cieno y un huracán de negras palomas que chapotean las aguas podridas. La aurora de Nueva York gime por las inmensas escaleras, buscando entre las aristas nardos de angustia dibujada. It's the beginning of the poem. He himself says that a social accent is incorporated into my work. Once again, Lorca recovers his former spirit as a poet of the people, a poet of the gypsies, condemns a civilization, capitalism, that degrades, that alienates man, progress devoid of the human dimension. And the complaint acquires characters of incredible strength, surreal symbolism, nightmarish image, Dali's dreamlike, surreal paintings. The words face each other, organizing themselves on 2 axes. Again, geometry and anguish, clashed between positive and negative connotations. On one side, the dawn, the arrival of light, the hope, but threatened by shadows is the frustration, the murder of the dawn. The dawn reaches a hostile world, enemy of light, something vital for an Andalusian man like Lorca. Flamenco. If there is something that Lorca loved greatly, it was flamenco. Lorca's favorite neighborhood was Harlem, where he heard black spirituals and jazz tunes that reminded him of Spanish folk music, especially his beloved cante hondo, traditional flamenco, that we will listen to by Enrique Morente, flamenco rock singer. Lorca's poetry, so torn of social denunciation, is very well assimilated to flamenco. In Cuba, the last part of... no, okay, we will listen to Enrique Moreno.
Vale, le vamos a hacer porque mucho corría. Sí.
As we have said, Lorca's first vocation was musician, and that seed always accompanied him in the life from his initial piano studies, later collaborating with Falla and collecting and harmonizing popular songs. As in the case of Ciurlionis, musical references are not lacking both in his poems and in his drawings, especially musical titles of his poems. It is not difficult to trace the music in his poetry and in the musical titles. The poem titled Pequeño Vals Vienés, Little Viennese Vals, already has the ternary rhythm and the repetitive cadence in the title. Vienna, again, that Lorca never saw, never knew. Ciurlionis, yes. It is included in the last section of this book, significantly titled Escape from New York, Two Valses Toward Civilization, as if New York were the antithesis of civilization and Vienna the ideal. There are verses of extraordinary musicality sung in English by a lover of Spanish and Lorca, such as the Canadian singer Leonard Cohen, who we are now going to listen to. As before, I will read in Spanish, but that in order that you can hear the sound, original sound, and you can see the translation. Pequeño vals vienés. En Viena hay 10 muchachas, un hombro donde solloza la muerte y un bosque de palomas disecadas. Hay un fragmento de la mañana en el Museo de la Escarcha. Hay un salón con 1000 ventanas. Ay, 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 ay. Toma este vals con la boca cerrada. Este vals de sí, de muerte y de coñac, que moja su cola en el mar. Te quiero, te quiero, te quiero. We will listen to now. New York, yeah? Is and has probably been the most photographed city in the world. But perhaps the best photograph of his polyhedrical reality in the convulsive area of 1929 was not taken by a photographer, but by a poet, Federico García Lorca, in a book of drawing and poems, Poet in New York. Thus, through the study of drawing, a poem and 2 songs, the visual, the verbal, and the auditory complement each other to better understand the soul of an integral artist. The verbal, the visual, and the auditory constituted for that Lorca 1929 a single creative compulsion in response to an external and internal situation that overwhelmed him, the same path that years ago Ciurlionis had taken with his painting and music. In June 1930, Lorca was already back in Spain after a dense 1-year journey. Once in Granada, he founded the University Theatre Company La Barraca. Just 6 years later, on July 18, 1936, the Civil War broke out. Lorca is arrested in August, accused of being a spy for the Russian due to probably his social commitment and homosexual, was shot at dawn, on August 19. This is how the voice of the poet, painter and musician Federico García Lorca was silenced. Silent. Thank you very much.
Thank you.